In this video, we are going to be looking at the superior mesenteric artery. But before we do, let's have an overall recap on the blood supply to the abdomen based on its embryological formation. The gut tube is divided into three parts. First we have the foregut, followed by the midgut, and finally the hindgut. Here I have included the huge artery that runs down the posterior abdominal wall. This is the abdominal aorta. The aorta supplies for the fore, mid and hindgut through three separate branches. Supplying the foregut, we have the celiac trunk. The midgut is supplied by the superior mesenteric artery, and finally the hindgut, which is supplied by the inferior mesenteric artery. In this more detailed schematic, we can see that the celiac trunk supplies the stomach, liver, spleen and the proximal duodenum and most of the pancreas. The superior mesenteric artery supplies some of the pancreas, the distal duodenum, the small intestine and the ascending and most of the transverse colon, whilst the inferior mesenteric artery picks up where the superior mesenteric left off, supplying the last quarter of the transverse colon, the descending and the sigmoid colon. There is a really good mnemonic for remembering the branches of the aorta. That is, canned soup, really good in cans. From top to bottom, we have the celiac trunk, the superior mesenteric artery, the renal arteries, the gonadal arteries, the inferior mesenteric arteries, and the common iliac arteries. This can seem a little daunting, so let's focus our efforts on the superior mesenteric artery as promised. The superior mesenteric artery branches off the abdominal aorta immediately underneath the celiac trunk, approximately the level with L1. This image is an unravelled image of the small and large intestine, so let's add some labels so we can orient ourselves with the anatomy. We have the pancreas, the duodenum, the jejunum, the ileum, the appendix, the cecum, the ascending colon, the transverse colon, and finally the descending colon. We can see that the blood supply to most of this viscera is coming from branches of the superior mesenteric artery. I'll move the contents of the abdomen to the left so we could slowly dissect the branches coming from the SMA now. As mentioned earlier, the pancreas gets most of its supply from the celiac trunk, but the inferior portion of the head receives branches from the superior mesenteric artery. These are the inferior pancreatico-duodenal arteries. These branches anastomose with the superior counterparts off the gastroduodenal artery from the celiac trunk and form the collateral circulation of the inferior head of the pancreas. For the rest of the arteries of the superior mesenteric, it is necessary to work backwards through the digestive tract, so our next branch is called the middle colic artery. This anastomoses with the left colic artery from the inferior mesenteric artery and supplies the first 3/4 to a half of the transverse colon, and it anastomoses with the right colic artery to provide collateral circulation to the hepatic flexure of the transverse colon. The right colic artery is our next branch of interest. This branch travels retroperitoneal to the ascending colon, and as already discussed, this branch anastomoses with the middle colic artery to supply the latter portion of the ascending colon. But, as nearly with all abdominal vessels, the right colic artery also anastomoses with the ileocolic artery to supply the first portion of the ascending colon. Which brings us on to our next branch, the ileocolic artery. This artery, as its name suggests, goes to supply the ileocolic junction. It passes retroperitoneal again, anastomosing with the right colic artery, providing collateral circulation to the ascending colon and cecum. It also gives an inferior branch that supplies the appendix vermiform and the distal ileum, the latter portion of the small intestine. Our final but none the least important arteries are those that supply the jejunum and the remainder of the ileum, the small intestine. These are the intestinal arteries, and in order to get to their destination, These arteries travel within the mesentery proper. More and more collateral circulation form here, as the branches of the ileal and the jejunal arteries form web-like structures referred to as an arcade. They ultimately anastomose with the end of the superior mesenteric artery. So our picture is looking quite colourful now. But what about this final bit here, the descending colon? Well, remember, the descending colon is part of the hindgut, so it is supplied by the final branch, the inferior mesenteric artery, not the superior mesenteric artery, so this will be investigated at another time. So for a final summary, working through the gut tube this time, we have the superior mesenteric artery, which supplies the midgut. The jejunum and the ileum are supplied by intestinal arteries, whilst the cecum and appendix are supplied by the ileocolic arteries. We then have the ascending colon, which is supplied by the right colic artery, and the transverse colon, which is supplied by the middle colic artery. The descending colon is not supplied by the superior mesenteric artery, but by the inferior mesenteric artery, which we will look at in our final video of the series of the blood supply to the abdominal viscera.